Visiting Europe in the 1990s wasn't as different as you might imagine. You still toured museums, ate local food, explored outdoor markets, and spent afternoons on the beach, all just like today. But nearly everything that happened between those experiences was completely different. Finding your hotel, navigating a city, taking photographs, getting information, and even paying for things required routines that have now almost disappeared. I'm Roger from priceoftravel.com, and I traveled around Europe extensively throughout the 1990s. Here are 8 everyday parts of those trips that would feel almost unrecognizable today. If you were there, you know that home internet service was still gaining traction in the late 1990s, and most independent travelers still planned their trips using printed guidebooks. A good guidebook contained information about attractions, tours, hotels, restaurants, transportation, and even local customs. I was always very fond of Rick Steves for Europe and Lonely Planet for almost everywhere else. Both are still excellent resources, but they were much more important when nearly all of your reliable travel information had to fit inside one book. There were plenty of other choices, including Fodor's, Let's Go, and the wonderfully visual eyewitness guides, but most people seem to choose one and use it to plan virtually their entire trip. Your guidebook became your travel agent, hotel directory, restaurant advisor, and local expert. Rick Steves would usually recommend only a handful of hotels and guest houses in each city. In those days, you might call ahead or simply arrive after getting into town and ask whether a room was available. Some properties even offered a discount, often around 10%, if you mentioned Rick Steves. I stayed in many of his recommended hotels over the years and was always happy with them. One of my favorite memories was sitting at the included breakfast in one of those small hotels and noticing 1 or 2 other guests paging through exactly the same Rick Steves guidebook I was using to plan my own day. We were all supposedly independent travelers, but we had bought the same book, stayed at the same hotel, and were probably about to visit the same places. Closely related to printed travel guides is the fact that even in the late 1990s, a map meant an actual piece of paper. Most guidebooks included a few basic maps, and those were usually enough to get you between the main square, the train station, and the biggest attractions. But if you needed to find your hotel, a particular restaurant, or anything else that wasn't marked in the book, you needed a proper street map. Fortunately, most official tourist information offices, and we'll get to those later, gave away small paper maps. You could tell the person behind the counter where you were staying, and they would circle your hotel and perhaps draw a line showing you how to get there. Hotel reception desks also kept stacks of maps and would circle the hotel before sending you out to explore. The weird part, looking back, is that there was no blue dot showing your location. You had to find a street sign, locate that street on the map, and then work out which direction you were facing. If you made a wrong turn, the map didn't recalculate the route or politely tell you to turn around. You might walk several blocks before realizing something didn't look right. Many travelers also carried the hotel's business card, partly so they could show the address to a taxi driver or ask someone for directions if they became completely lost. For getting around most of European city centers, those free maps were usually good enough. But if you were driving or traveling between cities, you needed one of those enormous folding road maps that never seemed to fold back together properly. Many of us probably still have a box filled with them somewhere. Souvenirs from a time when getting lost was a genuine possibility. Another part of travel planning that could hardly have been more different in the 1990s was booking a hotel without the internet. Travel agents were still extremely common, so if you were arranging a major trip well in advance, an agent could reserve hotels for you by telephone, fax, or one of the professional booking systems available to the travel industry. But backpackers and independent travelers had other options. Guidebooks listed the telephone number and mailing address for every recommended hotel, but even a short international call could be very expensive. You could send an airmail letter requesting a room, although sending the letter, waiting for a reply, and perhaps writing back again could take weeks. As a result, many of us simply arrived in a city without a reservation and found a room after getting there. Because independent travelers were less likely to reserve everything months ahead, finding something affordable at the last minute was usually easier than it would be today, at least in my experience. Sometimes I would walk from the train station to one of the hotels recommended by Rick Steves and ask at the front desk whether they had a room. But the easier option was a hotel booking desk, which you could find inside or near the airport or main railway station in many European cities. You would wait in line, tell the agent roughly what you wanted and how much you hoped to spend, and they would suggest a hotel. Then, while you stood there, they would telephone the property, confirm that a room was available, and give the hotel your name. You would take the address and directions and simply make your way there. Considering how primitive and uncertain that entire process sounds today, it worked surprisingly well. Rates were generally straightforward and reasonable, and I rarely had trouble finding somewhere to stay. Today, arriving in a popular European city without a reservation might feel like an expensive emergency. In the 1990s, it was often just a normal part of the trip. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I would really appreciate it if you could hit the like button. Today, nearly everything has online reviews, so it's strange to remember that none were available for hotels throughout the 1990s, and even for a while after that. Popular guidebooks might include short reviews of perhaps 10 or 20 hotels in a large European city, generally focusing only on places the writers recommend. For the vast majority of hotels, there was no independent information available at all. You couldn't look at hundreds of guest photos, check whether the rooms were noisy, or discover that everyone complained about the mattresses. The hotels recommended by those booking desks at railway stations and airports were usually quite good, so the agents themselves acted as a useful filter. But some travelers would simply walk out of the station and go from hotel to hotel until they found somewhere affordable that looked adequate. You could inspect the lobby and perhaps ask to see the room, but otherwise you were making a decision based on very little information. There are good reasons to be suspicious of some online reviews today, and sorting through them can become exhausting, but I still prefer the current system and almost always find really solid places. In the 1990s, choosing an unfamiliar hotel could feel much more like a crapshoot, and sometimes you didn't discover the problem until after you had paid and unpacked. By the end of the 1990s, many travelers felt as though we had time traveled into the future. Instead of sending postcards that might take a week to arrive, most of us had email accounts and could correspond with friends and family back home almost instantly. Of course, the difficult part was getting onto the internet. None of us had smartphones, very few travelers carried laptops, and hotels providing free Wi-Fi was still many years away. If you wanted to check your email while traveling, you had to find an internet cafe. The early ones often felt like actual cafes with perhaps 2 to 8 desktop computers arranged around a table or tucked into a back room. You paid for access by the minute or hour, sometimes the equivalent of around $5 per hour, and tried to accomplish everything while watching the clock. Then, in 1999, only 4 years after founding EasyJet, the same entrepreneur opened the first Easy Everything Internet Cafe opposite Victoria Station in London. Instead of a few computers beside a coffee counter, it had an astonishing 400 terminals, stayed open 24 hours a day, and initially charged as little as £1 per hour. More enormous branches quickly appeared in London, and then in cities including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Barcelona. They looked less like cafes and more like factories filled with computer screens, but for travelers they were incredibly useful and dramatically cheaper than most of the smaller places. For a few years, finding an internet cafe became part of the normal travel routine. You would log in, check your email, perhaps research your next destination, and then disappear offline again until you found another one. Now we carry vastly more powerful computers in our pockets and remain connected almost continuously. Internet cafes once seemed like the future, and then the future made them almost completely unnecessary. I didn't buy my first digital camera until 2002. It was a 2-megapixel Canon that cost $399, and at the time I didn't personally know anyone else who owned one. Throughout the 1990s, for ordinary travelers, photography meant film cameras. Most of us used very basic point-and-shoot cameras that might cost only $20, but every roll of film cost around $5, and a typical roll only gave you 24 photographs. Developing and printing them cost another $5 or more. That meant every click of the shutter cost real money, so photographs felt limited and precious. You didn't take 20 versions of the same view and choose the best one later. You took 1 or 2 and hoped they worked. And there was no screen allowing you to check the result. You might not see your photographs until days or weeks later after dropping the film off to be developed. That was when you discovered that someone had closed their eyes, your finger was partly covering the lens, or the beautiful evening scene was almost completely dark. I also appeared in almost none of my own travel photographs because this was long before the selfie era. Unless I handed my camera to a stranger, I came home with pictures of buildings, monuments, and other people, but very few pictures of myself. That makes this blurry photograph of me with CNN reporter Christiane Amanpour at the 10th anniversary celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1999 especially rare. Excellent photographs were certainly possible with expensive SLR cameras and enough skill, but photography was an expensive hobby. Most travelers got by with cheap point-and-shoot or disposable cameras, which is why so many of our travel photographs from that era are blurry, poorly framed, and terrible by today's standards. The strange thing is we treasured them anyway, because those 24 photographs might be the only visual record of the entire trip. In the era of YouTube and Netflix, it's difficult to imagine how limited our entertainment choices could be while traveling in the 1990s. I stayed mainly in inexpensive European hotels, and every room had a television, but every available channel was in the local language. International channels such as CNN International and BBC World only became common in ordinary hotels years later. That was perfectly understandable, of course, but at the end of a long sightseeing day, there was often no English language news or entertainment available at all. I also carried a small portable radio that might receive 30 or 40 local stations, and every one of those would usually be in the local language as well. My hack was to bring a shortwave radio. With enough patience, I could eventually find an English language broadcast from Voice of America, American Forces Radio, or sometimes the BBC World Service. The reception would fade in and out through the clouds of static, but at least I could hear some news and find out what was happening outside the country I was visiting. World War III could have started while I was traveling, and my only source of information might have been a faint, crackling voice coming through a shortwave radio beside my hotel bed. Another part of European travel that could hardly have been more different was how we handled money. Contactless payments are nearly ubiquitous today, especially in Northern Europe, but in the 1990s we paid for almost everything in cash. International ATM networks were already widespread enough that I rarely needed traveler's checks, but withdrawing money could come with a fee of around $3, so you tried to estimate how much cash you would need without returning to the machine too often. The euro existed electronically beginning in 1999, but euro banknotes and coins weren't introduced until 2002. Throughout the 1990s, crossing a European border usually meant changing currencies. There were German marks, French francs, Italian lira, Spanish pesetas, Dutch guilders, and many others. I would withdraw local currency after arriving, then try to spend almost exactly the right amount before leaving. Any leftover banknotes could be exchanged at a bureau de change, currency exchange offices that seemed to be everywhere, but they generally wouldn't accept coins. That made the final day in each country a small mathematical exercise. You wanted enough cash to buy dinner and reach the train station, but not so much that you left with a pocket full of money that would become useless as soon as you crossed the border. Of course, most of us calculated it badly. That's why so many travelers still have bags or jars filled with old European coins, probably stored somewhere near all of those blurry photographs. As much fun as it is to remember all of this, I would still choose traveling around Europe today. It's easier, far more flexible, and far less stressful, but I'm glad I experienced both versions. I know many of you traveled around Europe during this era as well, so I'd love to hear which memories this brought back, and what other differences I should include if I make a part 2. Please give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more videos about traveling in Europe and other great destinations. Thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one.